The Electoral College. Why is it that the people don't directly elect the president, but instead go through this extra step with electors chosen by the parties? Well, when this system was first created, what they were really thinking was basically this. We can't just let the ignorant masses decide who the president is. We, the elites, we created this country because we were sick and tired of the British government telling us what to do, and we're not about to let the common folk throw a wrench in the works. That's the kind of thinking that gave us the Electoral College. Anyway, America had its first presidential election right after the Revolutionary War, which was basically a giant coup, right? So what was the vibe back then? What were the powers that be, the ones looking to get their piece of the pie, thinking? Whew, coups are terrifying. In that atmosphere of fear, a consensus probably formed that they needed someone with strong leadership, someone who could unite everyone. So who do you think got elected? Of course, a military man was chosen. He was elected in a climate of fear caused by the coup. And who was that military president? None other than George Washington. Former Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Let's be real. He was technically British, but he was the commander of the rebel army that successfully staged a coup against Britain. This guy originally came from a wealthy family in Virginia. His family owned many black slaves, and as he got older, he worked under the Royal Governor of Virginia, the British governor. So yeah, he's a founding father, but in his youth, he was part of the British military. In the late 1700s, right after the founding of the U.S., George Washington's status was absolutely massive. I mean, as the commander-in-chief, he must have won a ton of battles in the Revolutionary War with his brilliant tactics and strategies, right? So he was revered as this incredibly great figure. George Washington was elected president in 1789. For 6 years before that, they couldn't even elect a president. There were uprisings. You can imagine American society was in a pretty grim state. The first thing he does after becoming president is clean house. He starts cracking down, rounding up anyone involved in potential coups or rebellions to stop them in their tracks. And then he begins to attack the Native Americans indiscriminately. Remember what we talked about before? The American Revolution was a fight between the British Army and the faction of British subjects who wanted to found America. But from the Native Americans' point of view, they felt like those guys trying to create America will probably treat us even worse than the British. Because of that feeling, numerous native tribes sided with the British Army. And George Washington never forgot that. If we let these native tribes be, they could become a major threat to us later. It'll be a huge problem if they join a future coup or cause trouble. We need to drive them out first. So, in the process of driving out the Native Americans, the territory expanded quite a bit. The amount of land the U.S. had when Washington took office had nearly doubled by the time he left. So basically, under the pretext of cleaning house, he drove out the Native Americans, expanded the nation's territory, and stabilized public opinion. Washington was president until 1797. He died in 1799. And as soon as he died, all hell broke loose in Europe. Why? Napoleon enters the stage. With the arrival of Napoleon, what came next? The Napoleonic Wars, of course. Europe was a total mess back then, an era of absolute chaos. This is the territory Napoleon controlled during the wars. Look at it now. He had almost all of Spain. Napoleon expanded his empire to the point where he was about to swallow Europe whole. So when we study world history, Napoleon isn't just mentioned because he was famous or great. It's because the snowball effect of his actions had a massive global impact. And what does war mean? It means you're hemorrhaging money, win or lose. You just lose a little less if you win. What happens when a war breaks out? People with jobs suddenly become unemployed. For example, say a convenience store owner in his early 30s gets drafted. He's got to close up shop, right? And just like that, the income from his store vanishes. So when war happens, the economy gets wrecked. War is basically like declaring bankruptcy on yourself. This means with the Napoleonic Wars raging, they had to raise taxes, even though they knew full well their people were being drafted and sent off to die. But here's the thing, war is expensive, and they were out of cash. So what did Napoleon do? He started selling off real estate. He couldn't exactly sell off mainland France, so Napoleon's idea was to sell their colonies. And right at that moment, there was a brand new, freshly independent nation on the scene. Who? The United States, of course. America was there ready to play. And as it happened, the U.S. was looking to buy land. Where? Louisiana. To be precise, they didn't want the entire territory, but way down at the southern tip of that huge chunk of land, there's a port city called New Orleans. The U.S. wanted that port city so badly. Why? Let's say you harvested beaver pelts or corn up here. You could just load them on a boat, float down the river, and boom, you're right in New Orleans. It was the ultimate sweet deal. But whose land was New Orleans? It belonged to France. If the U.S. could just get New Orleans, what would happen? They could just float their goods down the river and sell them with ease. So ever since its founding, the U.S. had been eyeing New Orleans. And Napoleon? He wanted to sell land. The timing was perfect.
So the U.S. says something like, "Hey, France, my man, heard you're selling land these days. You've got Louisiana. Just sell us New Orleans. I'm buying." And France is like, "Make me an offer." That was the situation. The U.S. was planning to buy the port of New Orleans for $10 million. They went to France to make the offer, but France, they were sharp negotiators. They thought, hey, these guys look like they're willing to pay around $10 million for New Orleans. Let's try this. And then they said, yo, America, you're going to buy this for $10 million, right? How about you add another $5 million on top, $15 million total, and you can have all of Louisiana, the whole thing. Wow! They were just trying to buy one port city for $10 million. And for just $5 million more, France was offering them the entire Louisiana territory. That is an absolute steal. The clearance sale was insane. For just $5 million on top of $10 million, they were getting all of this vast land. The reason France was so eager to sell off its entire North American colony was because they were incredibly busy with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Meanwhile, in their colonies, enslaved Black people and local residents were staging rebellions all over the place. We're in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, we're going crazy busy. Who has the time to manage and suppress all that? Better to just sell it off. And so, because Napoleon couldn't manage his colonies while fighting a war, the U.S. bought Louisiana, and its territory expanded enormously. At the time, the average white laborer in America, someone working on a farm, made about $12 a month. And they bought Louisiana for $15 million. $15 million is $1.25 million times 12. They got it for an unbelievably cheap price. So just like that, one war in Europe caused all sorts of crazy things to happen in other countries. And then, about 60 years later, the U.S. ended up buying Alaska. When you think of old Russia, there's one incredible emperor who comes to mind, right? Peter the Great. You can think of him as the emperor who laid the entire foundation for the rise of the Russian Empire, a monumental figure. This guy was definitely a skilled politician. Back in the 1700s, from the perspective of other European nations, the Russian Empire was basically a nobody. The major European powers treated them like barbarians on the fringe. So Russia was constantly trying to shake off that image and expand its influence in Europe, basically saying, hey, let us be part of the cool kids club.
But from Peter the Great's perspective, he was thinking, look, these guys keep treating us like we're on the outskirts. Maybe sucking up to them isn't the only way. I should see what's cooking elsewhere. With that in mind, he sends a man named Vitus Bering over towards North America. It's freezing over there, right? He basically told him to go check it out and report back. And so, this Vitus Bering finds Alaska. That's why the sea there is called the Bering Sea. Oh, right, now it's our turn to make some money off this Alaska place. And just like that, Russia started making money in Alaska by hunting a ton of seals and selling their oil and fur. But then, something exploded onto the scene. What was it? The Crimean War. Man, Russia fights the Crimean War in the Crimean Peninsula for 3 years, from 1853 to 1856. And in that war, the Russian Empire got completely crushed. And what did I say happens when there's a war? The economy takes a huge hit. Just like that, after its major defeat in the Crimean War, the Russian Empire ended up selling Alaska. But why Alaska, of all the land they had? To understand that, we need to understand the era. Back in 1867, things like railroads and transportation weren't very developed. Russia's capital, Moscow, is over here, but Alaska is way over there, right? They just physically lacked the ability to manage it. On top of that, what was Canada at the time? A British colony. Russia had just gotten its butt kicked by the British in the Crimean War, and now there's this big British colony called Canada sitting right next to Alaska. Those Brits in Canada might come and attack this place. Most of the Russian army is over here. We'd lose it all before our troops could even get there. That means we'd lose it to Britain for free? Hey, rather than lose it for free, let's just sell it. And so in March of 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. But you have to remember what was going on then. It was only 2 years after the end of the American Civil War. The U.S. was also short on cash. Despite that, when they bought Alaska, people were saying things like, "That president is crazy. He's lost his mind. Why would he buy a giant block of ice, a useless piece of land?" But what happened with Alaska? Turns out it was packed with an insane amount of natural resources. From Russia's perspective, they just wanted to get some fur money out of it, saw that it was mostly ice and hard to manage, and figured it was useless, so they sold it off quick. But later they found out it was an incredible piece of land. Today, 85% of Alaska's entire state budget is funded by selling the oil and natural gas found within its borders. It's estimated that Alaska has somewhere between 4.3 and 16 billion barrels of oil. It's believed to have the largest oil reserves of any region in North America. And it's got a ton of salmon, right? Alaskan salmon is mostly wild-caught. The Norwegian stuff is often farmed. You gotta eat wild, people. So as we get into the mid to late 1800s, Alaska is added to U.S. territory. And if you go way west from the U.S. mainland, there's another territory, isn't it? Where? Hawaii!
Did you know this? Hawaii was eventually taken over by the U.S., right? It's U.S. land now because it was taken. But how exactly did that happen? Let me explain that for you. So, have you ever seen pictures of native Hawaiians? They look a bit like the Maori people. Kind of like this. They have a look that's somewhere between Asian and Black. They're called Polynesians. Many Polynesians live in places like the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and from there to New Zealand and Hawaii. Scholars have different theories about how Polynesians ended up in places like New Zealand and Hawaii. The general idea is that they likely migrated by boat along the islands over tens of thousands or thousands of years. Some went to New Zealand, others went to Hawaii, and that's how the Polynesian people of Hawaii came to be settled there. And Hawaii was a place where people lived in tribes. They were constantly fighting each other. And in 1778, the British explorer James Cook was the first European to arrive. At the time Cook found it, the Hawaiian tribes were in the middle of a civil war, all fighting to become king. Eventually, one tribe came out on top. And who was its chief?
King Kamehameha. He's the guy who ended the Civil War that started in 1782 and established the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1810. Up to this point, there was nothing in Hawaii. It was just a small island, and obviously there was no advanced civilization or anything like that. But then, as America went through the Industrial Revolution, what happened? They started building things like merchant ships and whaling vessels plated with steel, right? And if the U.S. wanted to trade with China, which way did they have to go? Across the Pacific Ocean. A merchant ship leaving from the U.S. on its way to China needs to take a break somewhere, right? You gotta stop at the service plaza for some coffee and a snack. And what served as that service plaza? Hawaii. And from Hawaii's perspective, having those trade ships use them as a rest stop wasn't bad for their economy either. The problem started when Americans began sending missionaries. Now, why is this important? Because religion has an incredible amount of power. What do you think happens when the people of a nation start to widely adopt a religion like Christianity, which is practiced in Western countries? At first, they might be like, who are these Westerners? These white people are here to plunder our country. But soon, that can turn into, oh my dear missionary, goodness, are you from America? From Europe? Just through that one shared religion, the local people's favorability toward that foreign country skyrockets. And that makes it way easier for the imperialist European nations to do business or just stick a straw in and exploit them. That was often the reason for sending missionaries. So, as more missionaries came to Hawaii, the number of people who believed in Protestantism and Catholicism would have gradually increased. Then, in the 1830s, a man named William Hooper was the first to buy land from Hawaiians and create a sugarcane plantation. Naturally, many other American businessmen followed him to Hawaii. As these foreign-owned plantation businesses started to do well, Hawaiians began to earn dollars. Before the foreigners arrived, Hawaiians lived by spearfishing, gathering fruit, and farming with pretty basic technology. Life was uncertain. But now, if you worked on the sugarcane plantation, they gave you dollars. And with that money, they started buying imported American goods, things they'd never seen in Hawaii before, like crackers, ice cream, cookies. On top of that, in 1875, the U.S. signed a reciprocity treaty with Hawaii for tariff-free trade. If you have tariffs, your products aren't price competitive, right? But if the U.S. imported Hawaiian sugarcane tariff-free, the demand for it within America would soar. But the problem was the Kingdom of Hawaii had no real economic foundation other than the labor for these plantations and its trade with the U.S. They were in a situation where they were completely dependent on the U.S. for their income. In exchange for giving Hawaii these benefits, the U.S. got Pearl Harbor. They didn't completely swallow it whole, but the U.S. government gained exclusive use of it. From America's perspective, what does having access to Pearl Harbor mean? It means they could use Hawaii as a military base. They could buy time by stopping an approaching enemy, and they could resupply things like food right there. Having a military base like that in the middle of the ocean is incredibly important. But remember during the Age of Discovery, why did so many Native Americans in South America die when the Spanish arrived? Disease. Europeans had built up some immunity to their own diseases, but the problem was these were illnesses the Hawaiian people had never encountered before. As huge numbers of Americans came to Hawaii, the native population was exposed to Western diseases and began to die off in massive numbers. So, they had been using Native Hawaiians as cheap labor on the plantations, but now that they were dying off, what did they do? They started a massive PR campaign in Asian countries like China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines saying, "Come make money in Hawaii!" As a result, a large number of Asians went to Hawaii to work in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So, the native Hawaiian population was shrinking due to disease, the number of foreigners running plantations was growing, and the economy was improving. So, what happens next? Inflation. Prices start to rise. The wages Hawaiians were receiving didn't go up much, but the cost of living in Hawaii kept climbing. As prices rose, they would have demanded higher wages, right? But the American and Western businessmen, who were basically running things with guns, would just betray them, beat them, even kill them. The Hawaiian people were powerless, so their protests were useless. On top of that, starting in the mid-1800s, the U.S. and other Western powers started pressuring the Hawaiian kingdom, saying, hey, you need to create a legislature. And what does that do? It creates a new structure of a king and a legislature. Of course, at first they coaxed them into it, saying things like, having a legislature is good for everyone. But the real plan was to use that legislature later to neutralize the king's power. It wasn't some benevolent attempt to spread democracy. Using the legislature they had established, they amended the Hawaiian Kingdom's constitution in 1887, turning the king into a complete puppet. So do you think the Hawaiian royalty just stood by and watched? No. In 1893, the monarch took a stand saying, how dare you strip me of my power? Restore the old constitution. Now, if the law changed back to give the monarch absolute power, what would happen to all the foreign businessmen in Hawaii? They'd start thinking, whoa, I've worked my butt off to build my business here. Am I about to lose everything? And so they launched a coup to overthrow the Hawaiian monarch. The coup leaders also riled up the native Hawaiians, telling them, if this coup succeeds, your lives will get so much better. And many Hawaiians actually joined in. The coup succeeded, and in 1894, an American named Sanford Dole became the first president. And just like that, a new country called the Republic of Hawaii popped into existence. But Hawaii is just a few islands. It's tiny. It was too precarious to survive as an independent nation, politically, economically, and militarily. It wouldn't have been surprising if another country invaded and took it over. So this guy, the American president of the Republic of Hawaii, spent 4 years lobbying the U.S. government, basically begging, bro, absorb us, please make us part of America. And eventually, the U.S. annexed Hawaii into the Union. That's pretty much how it went down. So, the U.S. has land it bought with money, like Alaska and Louisiana, and land it took through war, but it also has territories that were annexed without spending a dime, just by playing the long game. That's the key takeaway here.
All right. And with that, we're concluding the major series that we've been running since the channel started. From the story of Adam and Eve to Rome, Catholicism, and finally to the founding and territorial expansion of the United States, we've followed one long, connected story. I created this series with the goal of providing a light and easy to digest, but different perspective on the relationship between religion and politics and on key moments in world history. Instead of a textbook view, I wanted to give you a new angle that makes you think, oh, you can look at it that way too. I tried to make it fun, sometimes by being comedic, and other times by using exaggerated expressions. After watching all 9 parts of this series, what are your thoughts? If there was anything lacking, any mistakes, or anything you think could be improved, please be sure to leave a comment. This is a history channel that we're building together with you. I believe these videos will shine even brighter when your thoughts are added to them. I'm preparing more interesting history stories for the future, so please look forward to the next video. Thank you for watching.